The Habsburg dynasty ruled Austria and the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. Their rise was characterized by luck, tenacity, and clever politics.
The main ideal with which the Habsburgs became successful was to Felix Austria nub begin, so to speak, with the founders of the dynasty.
However, they were not originally Austrian. The family history began on the River Rhine, most likely in Alsace.
The policy of the Habsburgs at the time was to take over as much as possible from the minor landowning nobles and integrate it into their territory.
From the 10th century onwards, the Habsburgs were based in Aargau, now part of northern Switzerland.
The Habsburgs were seen for a long time as the bad guys in Swiss history. Today, we look at it in a bit more of a relaxed way.
From here, they set out as low-ranking nobility to rule first Austria and then a world empire. God save us. God protect us. On the 1st of April 1989, the old national anthem rang out once again in Vienna. On this day, Zita, the last Austrian Kaiserin, was laid to rest. Once more, the Habsburg monarchy appeared in its old glamour. After the Mass, the procession moved through Vienna from St. Stephen's Cathedral to the Imperial Crypt Burial Chamber.
Who desires entry? Zita, the Kaiser of Austria, crowned Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia, of Dalmatia, Croatia, Slavonia, Galicia, Lodomeria, and Illyria.
However, only Zita's embalmed body lies in the Imperial Crypt in Austria. Her heart stays in Switzerland, where she had spent the last 27 years of her life. Zita and Kaiser Karl were taken to Switzerland by the Brits at the end of the monarchy. In 1962, Zita finally settled here and spent the last of her 70-year exile in Zitzers, a town in the east. Her heart was buried in the Loreto Chapel in the Muri Abbey in Aargau. Zita herself had had the Habsburgs' last burial place built here.
The Habsburgs' remains were being divided up, with the internal organs going to St. Stephen's Cathedral, the bodies going to the Imperial Crypt, and the hearts to the Loreto Chapel in St. Augustine. And so, the decision was made to create a family crypt in another Loreto Chapel, this time in the cloister or Muri, and the first burial there was a heart. It was the heart of Kaiser Karl. He died in 1922 in Madeira and was buried there in the church of Nosso Senhora de Monte. But his heart was taken from him and kept by his widow, Kaiser Zita. And his heart was then buried in the Loreto Chapel in Muri in 1970.
Karl and Zita have been reunited here in death since 1989. Her heart now rests alongside that of her husband, Kaiser Karl, also in a black marble block. This burial completes a symbolic circle, as Muri Abbey in Aargau is the most recent and the oldest burial place of the Habsburg family. Here lie the first and last Habsburg rulers. The Benedictine Abbey was founded here in around 1027 by the Habsburg ancestor Radbot of Klettgau and his wife Ita of Lorraine. In the 17th century, Muri renovated the church in Baroque style and built an octagonal central room. This octagon in the heart of the church is unique and the largest domed central building in Switzerland. The mortal remains of the two monastery founders, Radbot and Ita, rest just in front of the choir section railings in the church. But Otto II, the first representative of the family to bear the name Habsburg, and other early Habsburgs are also buried in the church in Muri. Under the figures of the founding couple Radbot and Ita, the black inscription plaque on the monument lists all the Habsburg ancestors whose final resting place lies in Muri. Zita was the last Habsburg monarch to return from Austria to her Swiss ancestral home in Aargau. The first Habsburg to take a different path and link the future of the family to Austria was Albrecht II, known as the Lame or the Wise. Although his father Albrecht I was the first Habsburg to call himself of Austria, he never made his home along the Danube. It was his son Albrecht II who laid the foundations for the expansion of the dynasty's power in Austrian lands. He focused more on what Albrecht I still saw as the East and thought, yes, I can really make a bigger, more coherent area of this, something which doesn't cause me as many problems as these little areas in the homeland. So I think this is how the focus changed for Albrecht II to Austria. During his reign, the Habsburgs became firmly rooted in the Austrian lands, now ruling them for a second generation. It was he who consolidated the dynasty's power, as well as the acquisition of the Carinthia and Carniola regions. Albrecht II spent a great deal of time in Vienna, which increasingly became the center of power. But he did other things which were also very important for Austria. He had a chronicle, a kind of local history written, which was also done as a kind of propaganda to create a sense of community and to give these people a sense of self-confidence in their country. I find that very revolutionary, and another important thing he did for the Austrian consciousness was founding the Gaming Charter House, a monastery in Lower Austria, where he also decided he would be buried. I think it's very significant where these Christian rulers decided to be buried, because for them, that is their eternal waiting place until they are risen, so to speak. And to do this in Lower Austria especially, as a former Babenberg area, shows that the heart of the Habsburgs' kingdom was already in Austria and not stuck in their homeland. So I think these things were enormously important for Austria's image. Because of a vow, the monastery was originally to be founded in the parish of Malters near Lucerne. However, Albrecht, who had been entrusted with carrying out the vow, deliberately chose to found the monastery in Gaming, in the Lower Austrian Mostviertel region. He and his wife, Johanna von Fürth, were buried in front of the main altar of the church, which has been since renovated in Baroque style. This makes Gaming Charter House, therefore, the oldest burial place of the Habsburgs in Austria. With the election of Rudolf as Roman German king, they rose to the top league. With Albrecht II, the Habsburgs were finally established in Austria. But how did they get here in the first place? And where did they actually come from?
When Rudolph I was crowned in 1273, there was about a 300-year period of history that he could look back on. This is sometimes forgotten because it's an important key date. This 300-year history has its roots in Alsacia and Aargau. The first written record of Rudolph's ancestry is in Guntram the Rich, and we find it in the Acta Maurentia texts, which were written later, so they should be taken with caution. But the main thing is that he really did have a sphere of influence as a prince in Alsace. Guntram had a son, Lansolin of Altenburg, and it was either Guntram or his son who acquired land in what is now Aargau, so the development was actually already in place with their ancestors, as well as their wish to settle there.
Bei den Vorfahren schon angelegt. Es war ihr Wunsch eben, sich hier auch niederzulassen.
In order to be able to manage these acquired territories in Aargau, and above all to protect their own lands and borders with neighbouring countries, they needed a castle. A castle was a symbol of power which could be seen from afar. Radbot, the son of Lansolin, took on the task.
In connection with the legend that a hawk led him to Wülpelsberg mountain, and he saw it as a sign that the Habsburgs' base would be there, the name Habsburg is thought to be derived from the name of the hawk, so from Habichtsburg to Habsburg.
It is hard to imagine that the mighty House of Habsburg could have begun in what today appears to be a modest castle with the same name. But the early Habsburgs already had all the key ingredients for later success.
On the one hand, they were lucky that certain dynasties were dying out. On the other hand, there was a marriage policy which was noticeable from very early on. And thirdly, they had a certain tenacity that was necessary to get where the Habsburgs got to.
The initial spark in the Habsburgs' meteoric rise to power was the election of Rudolf I as Roman-German king in 1273. The election took him by surprise, as he was only a minor count, not one of the most powerful princes in the country. King Ottokar II of Bohemia was by far the most important imperial prince at the time and saw himself as the natural head of the empire. However, his seemingly unstoppable rise was too rapid for other imperial princes, so they decided in favor of a compromise candidate. However, Rudolf surprised everyone.
It was hoped that he would bring calm to what were troubled times. He was no longer a young man. He was 55 years old when he was elected. So, in my opinion, that was certainly one of the criteria. And he demonstrated this mix in his personality with goodness that was sometimes, of course, stylized as this sort of good count. But he also had his very warlike side, so he was able to balance between the two sides very well. So I think it was his overall personality that stood and led him to being chosen. Of course, the people were hoping for something and counting on him because they believed he would be able to bring peace and structure back to the Holy Roman Empire.
Rudolf was a skilled diplomat. As head of the empire, the pragmatic Habsburg was aware of his limitations. His dynasty was still too new, and so he took a slow, cautious approach to expand his position. Nevertheless, he was able to further expand the family's lands and established a closed area of power in the southwest of the empire. Rudolf was therefore by no means the poor count that later generations stylized him as.
Throughout his reign, something also happened at that time which seems important to me: the role of cities. I imagine that Rudolf was not a rural sort of castle ruler, but rather a city type. He founded a Habsburg base in Brugg, and he said that knighthood was over and that the future lay in the cities.
In Brugg, the existing settlement was fortified and granted city rights. The location was convenient in terms of transport, laying on the narrow Aare Gorge. This made it possible to control trade and collect customs duties. Brugg has retained its medieval character to this day.
But here, at the Wildegg Castle near Brugg, we also have traces of the Habsburgs, like the two-towered castle that's very typical of a Habsburg castle. You can't see it from the outside today, of course, because the castle has since been redeveloped as a Baroque castle. But basically, at its core, the castle is Habsburg. Lenzburg Castle nearby also experienced a time when the Habsburgs resided there, on the Lenzburg Hill.
In the Swiss town of Baden, which was founded in 1297, the Habsburgs established their first administrative headquarters. Baden had market and town rights and was authorized to levy custom duties. Above the town was Stein Castle, where the early archives of the Habsburgs were also housed. These Habsburg foundations are still flourishing today, and the towns and cities cover the region of Aargau with a rich urban network, where economic and cultural life unfurls around the historic center of the towns. With the expansion of the towns, Rudolf proved to be a modern and progressive king who was perhaps not as compliant as his electors had hoped.
When Rudolf of Habsburg was elected king in 1273, he had a conflict with the most powerful of the imperial princes from the outset. This was, of course, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, who then wanted to be lord of the Babenberg lands.
It was clear to Rudolf that he could only gain full authority as king if he neutralized this powerful rival. His first move was a political one. He demanded the return of the lands that Ottokar had annexed.
There was no conflict yet, but they reached a compromise. Rudolf was allied with virtually the whole of the Holy Roman Empire against Ottokar, and a compromise was reached in Vienna, where Rudolf surrendered his Chemistlied inheritance, so Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia. But he took the Babenberg lands and made them directly subject to the empire. Rudolf resides in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna as King of the Holy Roman Empire, but not as Duke of Austria, as the Habsburgs were not yet sovereigns of those lands.
The compromise in Vienna seemed to be a peace agreement, but it was only a reprieve until the inevitable battle. In August 1278, Rudolf defeated Ottokar in the famous Battle on the Marchfield. His arch-rival was eliminated.
And now Rudolf did something very, very clever. He knew exactly how far his power would go, and that it wouldn't be enough to seize the lands of his former opponent as well. In other words, he immediately recognizes Ottokar's son as the new king of Bohemia and betroths him to his own daughter. This great concept underpins the mantra with which Habsburgs became successful. Tu Felix Austria nub, begin, so to speak, with the founders of the dynasty.
Rudolf then set about securing the former Babenberg lands of Austria and Styria. In 1282, he entrusted his two sons, Albrecht and Rudolf, with the duchies of Austria, Styria, and Carniola in their entirety or undivided. It was only from this point on that the Habsburgs were truly the sovereigns of Austria. However, the enforcement of their rule was not without complications. The self-confident nobility did not accept joint rule from the brothers. Rudolf therefore appointed his elder son Albrecht as sole regent. The younger son, Rudolf II, was to be compensated with money or land. Refusal to follow this instruction would later result in a scandalous revenge. As the new sovereign, Albrecht filled important key positions in the country with confidants from his Swabian homeland, who quickly rose to become influential and wealthy aristocratic families in the area. This soon caused great resentment among the local elites.
And the local nobility was, of course, not at all happy that people from outside were coming in, posing as foreign subjects and trying to oust them. Yes, the policy of the Habsburgs at the time was to take over as much as possible from the smaller rulers and integrate it all into their territory.
So you have to imagine that when someone came from the former Switzerland, they spoke differently and looked different, so you could tell that they were a foreigner straight away. Even the nice king himself, Albrecht, was also a foreigner in Vienna. You have to imagine these kings a little bit like top managers today, so they would start in Frankfurt, then go to New York, then come to London. But they're sort of a foreigner everywhere they go, so it didn't matter too much that Albrecht was a foreigner in Vienna. The problem was that his underlings, the ones who governed for him, they were seen as foreigners, which led to uprisings. Albrecht cracked down hard on these uprisings and stopped the revolts in Vienna and Styria. Albrecht married Elisabeth of Gorizia-Tirol in 1274. She rose through the political ranks alongside her husband, initially becoming the Duchess of Austria and Styria. She had great insights into the political situation and was a significant influence on Albrecht.
Elizabeth of Gorizia-Tirol was apparently quite well educated. She could read and write, which he probably couldn't, and she knew Latin and was considered quite clever. She was also financially intelligent and enterprising, so she later suggested that they build salt mines in Hallstatt. She managed the empire's businesses whilst he was away, so he had confidence in her. And, if I may say so, they formed quite an ideal team, him being quite brutal and determined, and her being the mediator who can resolve things after a conflict and talk to the opponents after. So, really, a good team.
The two were apparently also a good team in their private lives. Their long, happy marriage produced 21 children, although unfortunately 10 died in infancy. So if you look at these 21 children from Albrecht I, their names are very interesting. On the one hand, he gave some Habsburg names like Rudolf, Otto, Albrecht, etc. But he also gave them old Babenberg names, such as Heinrich, Friedrich, and Leopold. And that was a useful political tool, because then his people could see, look, I remember these rulers from the past who are now gone, but let's try to build up these two countries' histories in a similar way. At the age of 40, Albrecht contracted an unexpected severe poisoning, which he only just survived. His contemporaries assumed it was an attempted attack. This isn't necessarily the case, though, as the food in the Middle Ages was extremely bad, no matter what class you were part of. The food spoiled often, you couldn't drink the water, so people drank wine and beer, which was mixed with this dodgy water, and people would constantly get stomach cramps. Then they also ate an incredible amount of grain, so they would pad out things like porridge with all sorts of seeds, which sounds funny, but it wasn't, because you would get all sorts of strong symptoms of poisoning from it. It could hit people at any time, regardless of whether you lived in a castle or as a peasant. But if a ruler got ill, they would say that it was, of course, a poison attack, and then a so-called doctor would come. According to the report, they hung Albrecht I from his feet, because they thought that the poison would then flow more quickly out of the body through the mouth. But actually, all of the blood went to his head and created so much pressure that one of his eyes was pushed out and had to be operated on. So these were typical medieval cures that we can't really consider medicine. In Austria, the unpopular Habsburgs were faced with renewed uprisings. At the same time, a conflict began in his Aargau homeland with the Swiss Confederation, who had formed as a defense alliance against their expansion. In this situation, which made the future of the house so complex, Albrecht fell victim to an assassination attempt. On May 1st, 1308, he was murdered by his nephew Johann Paretsida on the banks of the river Reuss in Aargau. Johann was laying in wait for his relative with some co-conspirators. Whilst crossing the river, Albrecht was separated from his party and struck down with a sword. The background of the bloody deed was the unresolved issue of the claimed settlement from Johann's father, Rudolph II. The younger brother had never been compensated as promised for being forced to renounce the Austrian throne 25 years earlier.
It was because of this hereditary hatred. That's all there is to it. He was frustrated, and if you think about it, people can't have thought more of it. The kings don't expect to get anything from assassinating the king. So they were outlawed and then pursued by the Habsburgs, and the four involved all died somehow. So one was probably executed in the castle, and the others vanished. There are different versions of how they disappeared.
In commemoration of this family tragedy, the widowed Queen Elizabeth of Gorizia-Tyrol founded a Clarion convent at the scene of the crime, called Königsfeld Abbey. The largely original stained glass window is one of the most impressive achievements of European Gothic stained glass artists. The depictions of the donors are still partially present in the windows, and bear witness to the importance of this location for the House of Habsburg. It was King Albrecht's son who finally tied the future of the family to Austria and initiated the estrangement from their Aargau homeland. He was known both as Albrecht the Lame and the Wise. He had had a very good education. I think that was also very important. He could read and write, which was very unusual for feudal lords, and he could also converse very well in Latin. All that was actually because he wasn't intended to be a ruler at all. Rather, he was the fourth son, so, as was usual later with the Habsburgs, he was promised to the church. And clerics always received a very good education in reading, writing, Latin, Latin and so on, so that's why he was so well educated. And then at the age of 15, which sounds extraordinary today, but it wasn't back then, he was ordained as a bishop. However, this wasn't approved by the Pope, so it was then decided that he would be removed from the clerical state and transferred to the secular state to rule, because his older brothers, who had previously divided up the land between themselves, had all died. Albrecht was the only one left, and therefore the power went to him. When Albrecht came to power, the first signs of the serious illness which earned him the nickname the Lame were already apparent. An autopsy carried out in 1985 showed that the Habsburg had suffered from polyarthritis, an extremely painful form of rheumatoid arthritis. Although he was severely physically impaired, Albrecht II was regarded as an important ruler. During this 28-year reign, the Habsburgs became firmly rooted in the Austrian lands, despite the fact that the middle of the 14th century was a time of great catastrophe, with earthquakes and plagues of locusts ravaging Austria at the time. There are chronicles which say that they couldn't see the sky for locusts. There was a huge plague of them which ate up the whole harvest. And then there was a cold spell with heavy rain, which devastated the fields once again. Then, of course, the main catastrophe was the plague. So various types of plague spread from the Crimean Peninsula throughout Europe. So in 1349, there was already plague in Norway, and here it began in Carinthia in Austria and spread throughout. So it really was a devastating period. Albrecht II mastered this turbulent period with flying colours. The Habsburg was recognized and respected as the imperial prince. His long reign was characterized by his moderate approach, hence his second nickname, the Wise. He acted incredibly pragmatically. He understood that there were things that he could and couldn't achieve. So through his whole illness, this so-called paralysis, which they didn't understand at the time, at some point, he realized he wouldn't be voted to be king. So instead, he concentrated on other things, like expanding the power of a new state which had just been added. That was Carinthia in southern Austria, which was more or less inherited and then ruled by a king from the Bavarian house of Wülpelsberg. And above all, I think it was key that he had a sister, and this sister sorted out the mess in their ancestral lands, while he was focused on Austria, specifically Lower Austria with Styria and this new Carinthia. And once all these smaller wars in Switzerland were resolved by his sister Agnes of Hungary, people called her the Queen of Switzerland. Agnes was the first Habsburg to rule over Hungary. As the wife of King Andreas III, she linked the young royal dynasty to the crown of Saint Stephen. King Andreas died just 5 years later, however, and Agnes returned to Aargau. She took charge of the newly founded Königsfelden Abbey and established it as a Habsburg center of power. And then she held court there in a nearby building on a really large scale. She was someone who really knew that she had to represent the people there to be taken seriously. So with the big house and the great dresses, she made a great appearance there. She also promoted the abbey a lot and managed all of the quarrels constantly happening underneath the surface quite well. So through these negotiations and small treaties, she ensured that there was more or less peace in this ancestral land for quite a long time. That's why she was known as the Queen of Switzerland, and that was the service of this very sensible woman. Incidentally, she was also one of the first women in the Middle Ages to own her own library. Meanwhile, her brother Albrecht had another problem to contend with. His lack of male offspring became a serious threat to the House of Habsburg. In 15 years of marriage, Albrecht and Johanna had 5 sons. However, all of them died shortly after birth. The dynasty was on the brink of extinction. A pilgrimage to Aachen was seen as a last resort. You have to bear in mind that he had to be lifted onto a horse. He had to ride around the area in a wheelchair, pulled by a horse. And so then they set off, with a huge entourage, of course, from Switzerland to Aachen, up the Rhine. And then they bought a lot of relics, all kinds of magical amulets. And then they returned again. And actually, 9 months later, Johanna gave birth to a Habsburg who became very famous, Rudolph IV, also known as the founder. Duke Rudolph IV was the most influential Habsburg of the 14th century. Despite his short life of just 26 years, his reign left a lasting political and cultural impact. The most famous of Rudolph's activities was a document forgery, Privilegium Maius, which placed his dynasty as the same level as the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. With this significant forgery, he made the leap to the Archduchy.
Duke Rudolph IV inherited the wise politics of his father, Albrecht II. He took over a stable country from his father, where the rule of the Habsburgs was securely established, so nor Rudolph could return to playing in the league of the powerful dynasties. The Kaiser at the time was Karl IV from the House of Luxembourg, who turned Prague into a European metropolis. Rudolph was married to Karl's daughter, Catherine, and he now tried, very cleverly, to copy what his father-in-law was doing in Prague with his resident city, Vienna. Karl founded a university in Prague, so Rudolph founded one in Vienna. Karl expanded the St. Vitus Cathedral, so Rudolph turned St. Stephen's Church in Vienna into a magnificent cathedral.
He laid the foundations for the conversion of the Romanesque parish church into a Gothic cathedral with a soaring tower, which still characterizes the Viennese skyline today. But Rudolph was unable to see the outcome of his visions. He died in 1365 at the age of just 26. As he remained childless, the regency passed to his younger brothers, Albrecht III and Leopold III. Albrecht ruled over what is now Lower Austria, Upper Austria, and the northern Austria Alps. Leopold's share included Styria, Carinthia, and Tyrol, as well as the Habsburg territories in what is now Switzerland. His sphere of power was fragmented, a complex mix of territories, many of which were not united under one cohesive administrative unit. Leopold ruled very harshly to maintain control over the family's domain. This brought him into conflict with the newly emerging Swiss Confederation.
That was also the challenge for the Habsburgs, how to govern over such great distances, and they didn't really solve this issue for a long time. That's why I would say that the East was more interesting for the Habsburgs in terms of power politics. There was mining in Styria, the Danube in Carinthia, with customs duties. The salt mines in Styria and Switzerland and the territories there couldn't compete with that. So this conflict here was actually more of a side issue, which, interestingly enough, was then played up very strongly in history from the Swiss perspective as a great struggle for freedom, which certainly wasn't the case from the Habsburgs' point of view.
Shortly after the death of Rudolf I, the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden signed the Eternal Confederation, which was intended to protect their freedoms against the rising Habsburg desire for power. This gave rise to the Swiss Confederation. It was the beginning of a long-lasting conflict with the Habsburgs.
Leopold launched a campaign against the Confederation and led his army into a battle against the poorly armed Swiss at Sempach near Lucerne. Despite being outnumbered, the Swiss were far more mobile and determined in the difficult terrain. This was followed by a spectacular defeat at the Battle of Sempach in July 1386, when the Swiss peasant army defeated the professional army of knights. Duke Leopold III fell in battle. For the House of Austria, the consequences of the defeat were serious. It led to a collapse of power in the Swiss Aargau territories and initiated the withdrawal from areas which would later become part of the Swiss Confederation.
Leopold launched a campaign against the Confederation and led his army into battle against the poorly armed Swiss at Sempach near Lucerne. Despite being outnumbered, the Swiss were far more mobile and determined in the difficult terrain. This was followed by a spectacular defeat at the Battle of Sempach in July 1386, when the Swiss peasant army defeated the professional army of knights. Duke Leopold III fell in battle. For the House of Austria, the consequences of the defeat were serious. It led to a collapse of power in the Swiss Aargau territories and initiated the withdrawal from areas which would later become part of the Swiss Confederation.
For a long time, the Habsburgs were the bad guys in Swiss history. Today, people are a little more relaxed and open-minded about it. This nationalistic view that Habsburgs equals foreign equals German no longer holds today. So people are now quite proud of this Habsburg heritage and would like to show that the formation of the Swiss Confederation was not a simple linear process, but rather a result of different developments coming together. The Habsburgs still have their foothold in Muri today, with their burial places, and thus still continue to cultivate a part of Habsburg memory here in Aargau.
Here in Muri, a 1,000-year journey has come full circle. From the beginnings of a family of counts to the hearts of the last ruling couple.